beings as much as the inalienable faculties of humanity itself, which, as Cocca put it, found its highest expression in planetary function. To even begin to understand the law of mankind, lawyers needed to, quote, place ourselves upon one and single starting point, the position we have within our world as a whole and facing the universe. In this way, we shall have a fixed basis free from all willfulness. Man's conduct in the cosmos will turn unpredictable unless he is not offered this basis and this idea of what is legitimate and what is not, Cocca wrote. The notion of a jus humanitatis underpinned Cocca's repeated attempts at drafting legislation for the moon. His first draft came in 1958 at The Hague, historic seat of international arbitration and human rights, where he outlined both positive and negative approaches to lunar governance. In this first attempt, Cocca imagined 5 prohibitions. Notice that each item on this list is a negation: does not, cannot, no rights. So-called negative or prohibitory law was crucial to germinal space jurisprudence. The cosmos, ambitious lawyers thought, was an empty canvas onto which new coda could be painted, and the first task was to establish that which was to be kept out of the new regime: imperialism, hypernationalism, war, and greed. Cocca developed another draft 5 years later in Bulgaria, one that guaranteed freedoms rather than casting restrictions. Presaging many of the articles of the Outer Space Treaty, Cocca's second attempt guaranteed the free use of the moon, made possible the common exploitation of its resources, as well as an easement for interplanetary traffic. When the General Assembly did adopt the Outer Space Treaty late in 1966, Cocca was elated, but noticed that the agreement elided the issue of, quote, the moon's richness and celestial products, end quote. And so, in 1969, on the eve of the first moon landing, Cocca submitted a brief proposal urging the Copious to study the legal status of lunar resources. Knowing full well that Apollo 11 would return physical samples from the moon, Cocca felt that the question of lunar wealth had acquired an urgency demanding preemptive action. And others agreed. Argentina combined its proposal with 2 others by France and Poland, recommending the need for a thorough study of a legal regime for the moon. Copious took action on Cocca's proposal a year later, and by that time the Argentine found himself with the authority and the professional chops to turn his legal theories into an actionable program, for the 45-year-old lawyer had become his nation's chief representative to Copious. He took his chance. On the last day of the conference, which met in June 1970, Cocca formally submitted a draft treaty of 5 concise articles, all devoted to the nature and proper governance of lunar resources. Its language reflected the primacy of the UN space resolutions, the OST, and Cocca's own work on the subject since 1958. Notice the inclusion of the Common Heritage of Mankind clause in Article 1, and the reference in Article 4 that the benefits of exploitation would be made available, quote, without discrimination of any kind, end quote. Here was jus humanitatis in his purest expression. But however strongly Aldo Cocca might have advocated on behalf of a formal structure for lunar governance, it seemed at the end of the 1960s that a moon treaty might remain a purely theoretical exercise. Though scholars still debated the specifics of this or that principle, little was transformed into concrete proposals. The Copious took no action on either of Argentina's draft texts, and among those few countries, like the United States, who bothered to notice Cocca's submissions at all, only puzzlement, sometimes even mockery, ensued. In any case, the Outer Space Treaty appeared to answer fundamental questions about the legality of human activity on and around the moon. Why, many reasonable lawyers asked, move so quickly from general to specific mechanisms? And yet, for the Soviet Union at least, lunar governance presented an invitation and an opportunity. An established legal regime for the cosmos, begun with the Declaration of Legal Principles in 1963 and the OST 4 years later, was still in its infancy. The technology necessary for space activities, many areas in which the Soviet Union led, was still limited, and the number of countries with sufficient knowledge or political capital to claim a stake in space could be counted on one hand. This was a vacuum begging to be filled. Moscow's leadership in space technology, and by extension space politics, ensured that its political interests would act as the engine for its space law proposals at the UN. When those interests converged with Cocca's, the ball began to roll. In a letter to UN Secretary General U Thant in May 1971, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko asked the General Assembly to develop a treaty to govern the moon. Gromyko reported that Soviet opinion was now geared toward further elaboration of space law. He mentioned neither Argentina's recommendations for a lunar treaty nor its draft articles submitted just the year before. Gromyko's letter, published in full by TASS, included a Soviet draft. Consisting of 15 articles, as opposed to Cocca's original 5, the document contained provisions strikingly similar to those in the OST. It reaffirmed prohibitions on installing nuclear weapons on or around the moon and the establishment of military bases. It reified freedom of exploration. It linked lunar governance to the Charter of the United Nations. And it obliged parties to carry out lunar exploration in ways that would avoid, quote, any adverse changes or contamination. Why another treaty proposal when Aldo Cocca's draft was already available? How did Gromyko's draft advance the ball? There is no evidence in the available English language material that the Soviet Union gave the Argentinian text serious consideration. Like many U.S. officials in 1970, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs seemed to have regarded Cocca's draft as wholly inadequate. Academician Alexander Pirodov, lead Soviet delegate to the COPUOS's legal subcommittee, later argued that Cocca had focused too narrowly on the resource issue in his initial draft. Referring to certain Argentine legal scholars, Pirodov complained that they had, quote, limited the wide range of problems connected with future activities on celestial bodies to a single, admittedly very important problem, end quote. In our view, Pirodov recalled, this did not appear to be sufficient. Thus came the larger, more capacious version. Whereas Argentina's draft was specific, the Soviet Union's was general. Whereas Argentina's attempted to fill the OST's loopholes, the Soviet Union's attempted to construct its logical sequel, refining and elaborating language already edified in the earlier agreement. And while Cocca had devoted all 5 of his treaty's articles to the question of the moon's natural resources, only one of the Soviet Union's 15 articles addressed the question of property. One omission was particularly glaring. Gromyko's version did not include the common heritage of mankind principle. In fact, though Article 8 issued declarations about the moon's surface and subsoil, it did not mention natural resources at all. Now, how did the United States respond? Naturally, it took time for Gromyko's proposal, a provisional document concerning a marginal issue in U.S. foreign policy, to make its way through the organs of the American government. But closer examination there did not depart radically from the tepid reaction at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. When Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, called Secretary of State Henry Kissinger on November 19, asking him to spare a half hour for Gromyko's proposal, Kissinger seemed to hear of it for the first time. What about it? Kissinger asked. A certain treaty, Dobrynin gestured. Your delegation is saying, I don't know why he, Gromyko, is so interested in this treaty. Maybe he bought some land on the moon, Kissinger quipped. I'll look into it. A thorough analysis appeared the very next day. NSC staffer Arthur Downey wrote to Kissinger's assistant, Brigadier General Alexander Haig, echoing the American diplomats who had read the proposal that June. Downey had read the document beginning to end and concluded that it was, quote, generally of the motherhood variety, and that its provisions break no new ground and are generally considered meaningless or superfluous, end quote. It could even prove harmful. There was always the possibility that the treaty's 8th article might prohibit the United States from asserting ownership of material which we, he said, have brought back from the moon. Downey emphasized that there is some question whether our activities on the moon might be too restricted. NASA weighed in with its own analysis in February 1972, 3 months later. In a lengthy position paper addressed to the space agency's leadership, Arnold Fruitkin, deputy director of NASA's Office of International Programs, registered complaints that closely resembled those of the NSC. Gromyko's proposal was, quote, a rather clumsy attempt, one that does not advance international law significantly, and which, if accepted as proposed, would weaken the force of existing treaty provisions, end quote. As far as Frutkin could see, the Soviet delegation at Copious seemed to have simply omitted from its draft proposal things which it had opposed in the earlier Outer Space Treaty, namely articles on inspection and verification. Special attention, he emphasized, should be given to any adverse effect the new treaty might have on NASA operations. What to do? Gromyko's draft, however ungainly, needed a response. Outright rejection meant claims of bad faith and therefore bad publicity. An independent proposal authored by American diplomats would embarrass their important counterparts at the Copious and sow resentment. Whatever its faults, Frutkin felt that the government should be, quote, positive toward the Soviet appeal. If the United States engaged honestly with the text, it could convert the entire exercise into a positive one that will carry forward our interests, he wrote. The American Bar Association pushed the same line of thinking, only more colorfully. And you can see that quote here. And so despite its initial doubts, the US government agreed to begin negotiations, beginning with the Russian text. Time constraints prevent me from offering a full accounting of the Moon Treaty negotiations. Sorry, there's a train going by. It's like every 5 minutes. Time constraints prevent me from offering a full accounting of the Moon Treaty negotiations, which took place between May 1972 and November 1979, nearly a decade. Those interested in all the sordid details should consult chapters 3 and 4 of the book. For our purposes, the following highlights will suffice. 3 major obstacles stood in the way of a consensus. First, US and Soviet delegates disagreed about the proper scope of the treaty. The Kremlin's agents thought the treaty should apply only to the moon, whereas the American delegation felt that new treaties for each chunk of rock in the solar system would degrade the power of the OST and thus favored a single document to cover all celestial bodies. Second, the Soviets seeking to maintain the highest degree of sovereignty objected to a mandate that would force nations to report to the public in advance of any mission to the moon. Third, and most importantly, the Soviets quarreled with delegates from the Global South about the inclusion of the common heritage of mankind principle. All sides had clear motives. The United States wanted to promote space diplomacy while maintaining its freedom of action. The Soviet Union wanted to preserve principles of national sovereignty on the moon while positioning itself as a leader in preventing sovereign claims to the moon. Delegations from the Global South wanted to prevent neocolonial competition over the moon and a monopoly over its resources by the nations capable of getting to and extracting them first. Cocca wanted a grand, forward-thinking document providing legal elaboration and substantiation for the OST. Perhaps the humanist legal principles enshrined in a moon treaty could serve as a model for international law back on Earth, thus transforming it. All achieved a modicum of success. But all failed, too. For after a compromise had finally been reached in Geneva, the Moon Treaty collapsed at the international level. Many diplomats and lawyers were unsure of the agreement's necessity, given its similarities to the OST and the series of UN resolutions on space exploration that the General Assembly had passed throughout the early 1960s. Others determined that the negotiation of such an exhaustive and anticipatory treaty was premature. Better that interested parties first establish the viability of human life systems and key industrial capacities on the moon before wading out too deep. But most of all, there were critics in the West who considered the Moon Treaty the latest manifestation of redistributionist politics emanating from the Global South in its quest for a, quote, new international economic order, or NIEO, that might redress centuries of colonial exploitation. When the agreement arrived before U.S. senators, a score of interest groups, technology firms, spaceflight boosters, mining conglomerates, lined up to testify against it, particularly Article 11's Common Heritage of Mankind principle. That nebulous phrase caused more trouble than the agreement's original crafters had ever bargained for. Connecting common heritage of lunar resources to the UN's Third Convention on the Law of the Sea, also called UNCLOS III, which deployed the same term to describe the status of seabed resources, detractors hoped to pitch the Moon Treaty as a Marxist coup, and they succeeded. The Carter administration buried the accord in legislative review, and the Senate never voted on ratification. In the end, only a handful of nations ratified the accord in its first decade. Less than 20 ever became parties. What are we to make of this sequence of events? Allow me to conclude by outlining a few key takeaways from my 2 years of research. The first concerns Aldo Cocca, who can fairly be judged the Moon Treaty's single most important author. Cocca and the other Latin American authors to which Piradoff referred showed that notions of a discrete treaty to govern the moon emerge first not as a political question, but as a scholarly one. Cocca was uninterested in the contextual geopolitics of the Moon Treaty, demilitarization, space for peace propaganda, the NIEO, and instead remained committed to space law as a progressive and humanistic discipline. Recall that Argentina occupied an ambiguous space between the decolonizing world on the one hand and the US-Soviet binary on the other. The nation had won its independence from Spain at the beginning of the 19th century and so stood apart from the wave of decolonization that swept Asia and Africa in the decades after World War II. Cocca's idea for a moon treaty, therefore, emerged not from post-colonial ambitions to remedy European vampirism, but from his own beliefs about the unifying potential of space exploration and the transformative impact it would have on human relations. It is especially in light of the political controversy that the Moon Treaty later caused that the treaty's origins in Cocca's legalistic and temperate approach to space law must be borne in mind. A second conclusion concerns the United States. For all the energy NASA and State Department lawyers devoted to the negotiations during the 1970s, for all the press coverage devoted to the matter after 1980, and for all the effort expended justifying the agreement to the Senate, the United States had little interest in a moon treaty in the first place. Indeed, their lukewarm embrace of a separate accord was in abundant evidence at the Moon Treaty's genesis. U.S. officials paid scant attention to Cocca's activities at the United Nations, or else connected his 1970 draft treaty to the suspicious rhetoric swirling around seabed resources. When the Soviets proposed their own draft a year later, American agents inside and outside of Copious considered it useless, redundant, even harmful to the authority of the Outer Space Treaty, a rather clumsy attempt. Secretary of State William Rogers had corroborated this early insouciance amid the hair-pulling discussions with Piradoff's team over the scope of the accord in 1973. The whole treaty, he wrote, was a Soviet program about which the United States had never been particularly enthusiastic. The Soviet Union limped to the finish line as well. Having kick-started the entire negotiating process in 1971, Piradoff and the MFA's other delegates found themselves repeatedly on the defensive over the introduction of the CHM principle, over the scope of the treaty, and over advance notification of space missions. While it was the Soviet Union's willingness to compromise in 1979 that ultimately secured a modicum of victory for the accord, Moscow's delegation had by then sparred continuously and often emotionally with its counterparts from the global south. This friction belies the notion, widespread in popular American discourse about the treaty, that the Kremlin had been in league with the developing world to socialize the moon, that international communism and the NIEO were two halves of the same coin. This brings me to a third and, if self-evident, conclusion. The heart of the Moon Treaty negotiations was the question of natural resources. Questions about lunar mineral wealth, how to define it, whether it could be legally mined and processed, what regime, if any, might govern it, dominated academic debates about the moon throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The absence of clear answers, both in the Outer Space Treaty and in the wake of the Apollo 11 landing, propelled Cocca to formally recommend that the United Nations take up the task of a moon agreement in 1969. Recall as well that resource use was the central focus of Argentina's draft treaty, the first of many, submitted just a year later. Adjudicating the extraction and exploitation of lunar resources was by far the most difficult obstacle to overcome during the nearly decade-long negotiations. Not least, it was the issue that American lobbyists leveraged to squelch the Moon Treaty in Congress. And once the United States failed to ratify, nearly the rest of the dominoes fell in turn. The role that resources, particularly the CHM principle, played, politically, diplomatically, and in the imagination, is nearly impossible to overstate. Taken together, the roadblocks encountered by the Moon Treaty's architects might fairly lead one to believe that the agreement was doomed to fail, that power politics at the United Nations had strangled it in the crib. But this view, however abundantly obvious looking back at the denouement of the negotiations and the treaty's tepid reception in international law, is ahistorical. The Moon Treaty was the sum of hundreds of small decisions, and indeed the efforts of hundreds of people. The copious consensus voting procedure meant that tiny variations in national policy could produce wildly disparate outcomes. A treaty might not have emerged at all were it not for Aldo Cocca's early advocacy, the Soviet Union's influence in international space law, or later, a crucial diplomatic intervention by Austria. By the same token, the treaty might have succeeded were it proposed at a more hospitable moment and amidst friendlier conditions. The coincidence of the negotiations The coincidence of the negotiations with UNCLOS, with the expansion of the United Nations membership, and with the ascendance of neoliberal economics in the United States, guaranteed a quarrel between North and South. The Moon Treaty, then, was primarily a victim not of its own textual flaws, I leave it to the lawyers to determine that, but of its historical moment. As so many episodes of the negotiations demonstrate, the various parties were not really squabbling about the moon at all. They were fighting about economic justice. They were fighting about national sovereignty. And since continued lunar exploration presaged the extension of humanity to the moon, they were fighting about the future of international politics in space. As NASA prepares to send people back to the moon once again, the future of the treaty itself will no doubt resurface as a meaningful question. Perhaps Thomas Gangali has wondered, the agreement is not dead, but merely sleeping. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very, very much. That was an amazing and really insightful presentation. Well, we have now some minutes to a Q&A session. I have some questions myself. Cocca feared the death of the law in a world dominated by technological determinism. Are these concerns still relevant today? Today's in the lunar governance discussions, especially in the context of private sectors and resource extraction?
Yeah, so one of the main concerns that lawyers voiced in the 1950s and 60s, and you mentioned technological determinism, is whether technology would have to emerge first before new legal precepts were developed, because you would not want to erect new legal codes and then have them undermined by new technologies and new approaches to space generally, and new knowledge about space science. Cocca was firmly in the belief that you should erect basic principles first. And whatever technologies may have flowed from NASA or other space agencies around the world, they would have to deal with the basic moral frameworks around a jus humanitatis. And it seems to me that that original vision of a humanistic, of a moralistic space law that was divorced from technological development, no matter how fast or slow, is not a real present concern in 2025 as it was in 1955 when he first started writing about it. I can answer questions about lunar resource use specifically, but that's my general answer to your question about tech determinism.
Okay, thank you. You just recently said that, and it's in your book as well, the Moon Treaty then was primarily a victim not of its own textual fault, but its particular historical moment. So, do you think that the current context might once again shape the success or failure of the new lunar governance framework more than their legal content?
So I would say that the international environment is even less hospitable to a moon treaty now than it was in 1970. The main reason that it was inhospitable in the 1970s was because of the negotiations around seabed resources unfolding in UNCLOS 3. The United States under Nixon actually approved of the phrase common heritage of mankind for use in negotiations over the use of the seabed resources. But it quickly became apparent that that was a crutch that would inhibit the U.S. interests. And so they never signed the law of the sea. Now the United States is about as far as it can be from signing international treaties just on a base level. That's why you see the Artemis Accords accelerating at the pace that they are. I've lost track of how many signatories there are because more get added every year. But one of the articles in the Artemis Accords concerns the legality of extracting resources from the moon, other celestial bodies, asteroids, and it's a fundamental tenet that you can extract. The language in the Moon Treaty is much more ambiguous and much more controversial, and a lot of writers believe that the Artemis Accords are simply a way of circumnavigating the Moon Treaty. Even though the United States is not a signatory, it has to at least respect that it is part of the corpus of international space law. But it would be the last country I can think of that would sign a Moon Treaty, especially in light of the executive order that Trump signed in his first term, establishing the legality of extracting space resources. That was like one of the first actions he signed as president back in 2016 or 2017.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Well, in the chat, Alfonso Cocca says thank you on behalf of the Cocca family. Wonderful exposition. So there is any question in the chat, so I can read it. If not, I have another question, but you already answered. So,
and just while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I just wanted to say that there may be an opportunity for me at some point, if it comes along, to do more research, more in-depth research about Cocca. So, Alfonso, if you or any of the other descendants of Cocca would be willing to sit down for an interview at some point in the future, I would be very happy to take your contact information.
great. Great. Here, Professor Alvaro Arciés says, what do you think about the new draft on the Space Resources Working Group in COPOS? if you read
Yeah,
it.
I wish I had more information about this question. I finished this project in 2023, and it just took forever to get published. I have since moved on to other topics that have nothing to do with space or the moon. So I haven't kept abreast of developments at the United Nations, other than a few of the things developing about space weapons and space security. So I wish I had an opinion about the Space Resources Working Group, but alas, I know nothing about it.
Okay. So, well, if there is no other questions, I will with another of mine. Uh, Cocca advocates for a new legal category just humanities to govern outer space. In what way does this concept differ on res communis hominum? On how might this framework challenge the traditional notion in space? So you have some insight about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting when Cocca first started writing about legal issues around extraction, particularly, but the moon in general as well. He was in favor of re communi omnium. He compared it directly with fisheries, open law of the high seas, that essentially this was common property that could be extracted by any nation at its leisure. Um, but he eventually came to see later on about, let's say, by the mid 1960s, he was pretty firmly entrenched in this new mode of law that transcended international law. He considered the law of the high seas international law, but the law of space would need something over and above international law to encompass all of humanity. And those principles got adopted fairly easily and fairly swiftly into the body of the corpus of international space law. So if you look at some of the language, say in the 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles for Space, a number of the UN resolutions about space exploration and space law, and the Outer Space Treaty itself, you'll find something like the astronauts are envoys of all mankind. Outer space is the province of all mankind. Um, uh, Space resources are the common heritage of mankind. Um, and that it belonged to all countries, and this phrase appears in all of these texts, without regard for their level of scientific development. So there's this idea that no matter how developed or advanced you are on a scale of United States or to whatever, that you have an equal right to space resources and the freedom to explore space. But Cocca's interpretation, while it's gobbled up wholesale by the Argentinian delegation, which he leads, and members of the Global South delegations, the most prominent members of which are India and Egypt, it doesn't really make it far outside of those countries in terms of interpretation. The United States always considered those phrases to be more philosophical. They didn't really consider it to have a lot of legal content, and the Soviets just hated it. It was that every meeting, recorded meeting of the legal subcommittee in Copious, it has members of the Global South fighting with Pirdov, Molosov, other members of the Soviet legal subcommittee, that they just really disagreed on common heritage. So I wouldn't say that the interpretation, the language made it into the final text of the Moon Treaty, but the weight that would back it up in international law did not.
Okay, thank you very much. So there is a question from Alfonso Cocca. Is the US is not likely to join the Moon Treaty? Do you think they likely to another treaty could take its place instead in the medium to long term?
I've heard a couple things advanced. One is just the Artemis Accords become a new series of treaties. The reason they call the Artemis Accords is because individual space agencies will join on to those at their leisure, but they don't represent binding international law. All the accords really represent are a series of agreements by which all of the space agencies agree to conduct their behavior. Whereas a treaty is a bona fide text in international law in which all countries are obliging themselves to follow. And even if there are a handful of countries that have not signed on to the Outer Space Treaty, it has over 100 signatories. So it has the force of basically the entire world's agreement at this point, including Russia and the United States, the biggest players. The Moon Treaty, in contrast, the United States is not a signatory. Russia, China, India, only a handful of countries have signed it, and only a handful of those very small group of countries have space programs, which is a huge problem. But if the Moon Treaty is going to survive in some way, it'll be if articles from it are torn from the text and put into something that is more amenable to the space powers. And I can guarantee you that the phrase common heritage of mankind will not appear in that text if it ever does come to light. But I would say that probably the most likely thing moving forward is not a treaty. It would be something at the level of UN declarations or the Artemis Accords. I just don't think there's the appetite for signing binding treaties at this point, especially with the powers that be in the big three.
Like in the configuration of soft law or something like that.
In the configuration of soft law, which is how space law matured. It really took a while for soft law to turn into something more, but one of the arguments in my first book, the one that's coming out with Cornell, is that the Outer Space Treaty, despite having a unanimous voting procedure to adopt it, was very hard to get. And if it had not been gotten in the mid-1960s, it's almost assuredly the case that it would never have been gotten. So we should hold on to it for dear life, hold on to it very closely. And it has been followed by all of its signatories. No one has yet violated it in really any meaningful way. There was a scare with fractional orbital bombardment weapons at the end of the 60s, but that faded from view fairly quickly.
Okay, thank you. Well, if there is no further questions, oh yes, there is one. Do you have an opinion regarding the ILRS approach and the relation it has with the Artemis Accords? I think the ILRS is the project from China and Russia to establish
Oh, yes. Yes. I do have an opinion, only insofar as seeing things from the widest possible lens, it appears as though two bodies of space law are developing, one around the Artemis Accords, the United States and its allies, and another around China and Russia. And if those two countries are going to engage in projects in space, whether it's a lunar base, whether it's testing anti-satellite weapons, and they are not liable under the Artemis Accords, then you have a problem. You cannot have truly legitimate, truly global, truly binding international space law without China and Russia. And many of the most comprehensive treaties on the books in development at the United Nations, for example, PAROS, they have been developed either by China or Russia. And because they don't afford a lot of room for inspection, the United States has just dismissed them out of hand. But I think moving forward, we're going to have to deal, we as Americans are going to have to deal a lot more honestly with our two nemeses if we're going to have something that's actually binding to control the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party and Russia.
Okay. Well, I think that was the last one. So, well, thank you again, Stephen, for sharing your knowledge, for taking the time to talk with us. And, well, see you next time, probably here in Argentina.
I hope so. I hope that day comes sooner rather than later. Thank you all so much for coming. And if Alfonso, if you want to, my email is on my profile at UChicago. So just shoot me an email. I'd love to talk with you someday.
Okay. Okay, thank you and gracias a todos. Nos vemos la próxima. Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye bye.
Gracias, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.